So, always curious for leaders like you who end up in places like the Carter Center. Can you tell us a little bit about your own history and how you came to do this kind of work?
Sure. Well, thank you for being here today. Thank you for letting Amit and I get rid of our jackets. And thank you for sitting out in the audience on a steamy day. I come from Atlanta, Georgia, so this steam is something I'm used to. I know many of you aren't. But I started in this field for two reasons. One, I come from a family, my parents were both very active in community service, and for me, they taught all of us the importance of being active in your own community. Now, they also thought that that meant I was going to stay in Atlanta, Georgia, and I wasn't going to live all over the world, but I did eventually come home, as my mom likes to say, after visiting other places for 35 years, to take this job at the Carter Center. And what brought me through this, one, my parents raising me in a way that taught me the importance of working in the community. And secondly, I followed my husband overseas when he was working on his dissertation, and it gave me an opportunity to see what transitioning communities moving from authoritarianism and communism to democracy look like. And so I caught the bug both of the community service side and of the overseas side. And so when this job offer came for the Carter Center, a chance to actually come home to Atlanta and still do global work, that's what pulled me in.
Sounds wonderful. Now, I understand that John Lewis was at your wedding. Tell me a little bit more about that. What was that like to have somebody of that stature at your wedding?
Well, as I mentioned, my parents were very active in the community, and so I grew up with John Lewis and Andy Young and Maynard Jackson, all folks that were at our, not dining room table, but our breakfast room table. So it wasn't a surprise when we got married in 1992 that John, Congressman Lewis, was at our wedding. What was a surprise, and actually if anyone heard David Greenberg speak yesterday about his book on John Lewis, he actually, the only person I feel like I had told this story to was David, and it now shows up in his book, but I will say it in public now. John was at the wedding, and we were standing in line, and he noticed that I didn't have a drink in my hand, and having been staffed his whole life, he walked up and said, "Do you want a glass of wine?" And I said, "I'd love one." So he brings me a glass of wine, and two of my husband's relatives, who I did not know well, turned to him and said, "I'd like a glass of red, and my wife would like a glass of white." Yeah. So I said to them, "I didn't know you knew Congressman John Lewis." And John grabbed my arm really hard, and he said, "A black man in a tux in the South, I get this all the time. Do not let this bother you." It's obviously bothered me for 33 years, but that was sort of who he was, and that's who he was as a family member of ours in terms of someone who taught me some of the important lessons about how you deal with adversity when it happens to you. And I saw the position he took, and I also knew what it meant to me, and I don't really speak to my husband's relatives on that side anymore. But, they just made an assumption, and John knew they just made an assumption, and he was okay with it, which was different.
So this is not planned, but I will share that we unfortunately hear stories like that when students of color, patrons of color in particular, come to the Shitakqua grounds, that those kinds of assumptions or comments are made to them. And we're trying to change that. Many arts organizations focus on training their staff only or having those conversations with staff. And this year we're doing something different. We are inviting Chautauquans to be part of that solution so that if you see something like that happening in front of you, that you know that you can recognize that something is happening in the moment and that you can also step into that space and say something and be an ally. So it's a free workshop. It's offered 4 times a week called Creating an Inclusive Shitakqua, and you can sign up for free by going to chq.org/belong. Easy to remember, chq.org/belong.
And I think that's great, Amit, that you all do it here. And for those of you who always wanted an example of a microaggression, there you go. That was it, and that's how John handled it, but it's also how I handled it. But doing trainings like this are incredibly important just to recognize it. So kudos to Chautauqua.
When I talk to Chautauquans who come and report like, oh, this kind of weird thing happened at the Brick Walk today, most people are like me. I think of the most perfect thing to say 7 minutes after that situation has passed, right? So part of what we try to do in these workshops is give you the tools to bring that up in your tool belt so you can deploy it when it's needed, right? All right, let's keep going. That's not what was planned, but it was the right opportunity to say the right thing right there. So you took the role of the CEO of Carter Center in 2020, right, as this country was in the middle of a racial reckoning with the murder of George Floyd. What was it like to become a leader of the Carter Center in that very moment?
Well, one of the reasons we had been living overseas, we had been in Amsterdam, and as I called it, Never Never Land. That to us was a wonderful place to be for 3 years between 2017 and 2020. And so to come back to work at an organization for a former president who had started his inaugural address as governor by saying the time for racial desegregation is over, I thought, this is going to be timely. We work on global health and peace. I was coming back in the middle of a pandemic, and it was the perfect organization to walk into. But one of the things we had not reckoned with in the 35 years had been how much were we going to do domestically. And so as we looked at what was happening during, after the murder of George Floyd and the protests that we saw, we had to look inward, and we had to make decisions about what kind of work we were going to do. We did DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We just didn't call it that because it didn't really have a name. And so we are continuing to do that work, and now we look at what are some of the problems facing the United States. Rosalynn Carter spent her entire life trying to focus on mental health and looking at destigmatizing people with mental illness, and it really hits communities the hardest. The most vulnerable people are hit by this. And so one of the pieces of work we started doing was looking at the Mental Health Parity Act. And this was something that if you break your leg, you have private insurers who will insure you to have it, put in a cast. But if you have a mental health crisis, private insurers are like, wait, not sure we want to do this. And so now we worked on mental health parity legislation to make sure in Georgia in particular it was being carried out because it was a federal law, but the states weren't carrying it out. And so we went into communities, primarily African-American communities in Savannah and Albany and different places in Georgia, and put up billboards. Old-fashioned way of advertising. You put up billboards and you say, if you have an issue, call this number. And so we started doing some of those campaigns. We also worked on policing alternatives. People were getting picked up on the street because they were homeless, they had mental illness, and they were getting put back into our jail system over and over and over again. But if someone was in the car with a police officer and recognized, oh, this is a returnee, this is someone who we just need to talk to them about their daughter and we know who to call, or it's a medication issue, it helped answer some of the problems we saw in our own backyard. So that's what we started doing when we wanted to do DEI work and do it in a little bit more of an intentional way. And that's what the Carter Center has turned. We've opened a new chapter. It's not that we've turned a new leaf because it's work we were doing, but we weren't doing it as intentionally because we didn't see the need until 2020.
Sure. So as you know, in the last 8 months, the landscape around DEI has shifted. We still say DEI at Shitakqua. It is still in my title. Thank you. But I'm curious how the Carter Center is continuing that work. Have you had to shift focus a little bit? What has the last 8 months been like?
Yeah, so the last 8 months have been difficult. We still call it DEI2. Again, it didn't have a name 5 years ago. Now it has a name. Now it's not allowed to have a name. It's kind of hard to keep up with the semantics of it, but the actions are the important pieces. And so we are also looking a lot at polarization issues. We're looking at why the right and the left can't talk to each other. So the work that we do in communities across the U.S. are to have a right-leaning lead and a left-leaning lead, and they build teams so we can talk about issues that matter in their community, because all politics is local and all development is local. At the end of the day, what matters to Chautauquans and Jamestown, Mayville, are different than what matters to people in Atlanta or Charlotte, North Carolina. So trying to do those conversations and bringing them to the community level is sort of the direction we've been going in.
That grassroots work is just so crucial. So thank you for continuing that work. So let's think a little bit more globally. So we're talking about some of the impact of the new administration. Can you say broadly, specific, as the Trump administration is implementing its domestic and foreign policy, how do you see that globally impacting the African diaspora, Black people globally?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in my introduction, I kind of grew up at USAID of blessed memory. I spent 2 decades there. And so I can tell you the destruction of our foreign aid programs will affect us here domestically. It is actually very much linked. And so where we're seeing the greatest concerns, the Lancet magazine, which is a medical journal, talked about the fact that USAID saved 15% less mortality rates around the world because of the work that we did. Work on preventable diseases like anti-diarrheal diseases, respiratory illnesses, tuberculosis, that could be taken care of. These are preventable diseases that we have no way to take care of now. And then at the Carter Center, a lot of our work has been on neglected tropical diseases. So when you're dealing with malaria or river blindness, things that are transmitted through mosquitoes or black flies, they don't know borders. They don't know they're going to be tariffed to come over and give us a disease. This is a serious issue that we are trying to now figure out. How do we address it? And one issue happened just last week. We found out that Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company, had a number of drugs that were about to expire in Mozambique and Ethiopia. And we don't work in Mozambique, but we work in parts of Ethiopia. So we were able to lean in, use our staff to distribute their drugs so they did not go to waste. So when you have big pharma and corporations that are trying to help and make America a place that we are a reliable partner, this is what we're doing. And the majority of the people this is going to hurt are on the continent of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Lancet has also said that there will be 14 million people that will die in the next 5 years, and 4.5 million of those are kids under 5. And so that is what's happening with the destruction of our foreign aid program. And it's also the moral compass of America, is that we were a reliable partner who would step in and who would focus on things at the end of the road. And Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter come from a small town in Plains, Georgia, 400 people. And so they saw at the end of the road in Lafon, South Sudan, the same type of people that they saw in Plains, Georgia, and Americus, Georgia. And when they saw people who weren't able to farm their land because they had worms coming out of them, President Carter said, moonshot, we're going to eradicate guinea worm. And when we started that, there were 3.5 million cases of guinea worm a year in 21 countries. And as of right now, there's 1 human case left in the world. So, and when you build those structures out, when you have these community drug distributors helping to give medication so people don't, these kids, 4.5 million kids who are potentially going to die in the next 5 years, when you have the community drug distributors helping with that, they can also do other things. It's part of health system strengthening. It's making sure that communities talk to each other and share information. You'll remember, COVID hit, and the big question was, in Africa, people are going to die. Well, guess what? Their death rate was so much lower than the state of Georgia because they knew to stay home. They weren't going out. They didn't think that it was important to be out. If they weren't feeling well, they would just stay home. And those are the type of things that they would share information. That's how we are getting rid of guinea worm. They share information. Oh, so-and-so had a worm. And then we would go and look and figure out it was guinea worm. We'd figure out what pond they were drinking from. We'd treat the pond. And that was it. And so that type of community relations can help end global pandemics. It can help address all sorts of concerns that we have. But if you don't have the medication or the food and people are dying and children aren't getting nourished and we're burning 500 metric tons of food just because we don't want to give it to the countries, that's not a good look. So
I'm going to tell a story and then I'm going to ask a related question. So when I started here 4 years ago, my very first summer, I was introduced to a Shitakqua patron who is blind. And he loves to sing, so he wanted to come to morning worship, but he needed the hymns in Braille so he could sing along, right? And so I took care of that. We offer Braille to all our blind patrons. They just have to give us notice to, get that printed. And I was shocked when I announced that. For the most part, Chautauquans were like, I don't use Braille, but I'm so proud to be at a place that we offer it, right? And then I was shocked that one person stopped me and said, well, how much does it cost? And why are you putting all this time and energy for just one person? And it was that lack of empathy that was unusual, to be honest, for this place, but that was shocking for me. The reason I'm telling this story is I have heard other people say, well, why is it America's responsibility to care for these other people? So it's that lack of empathy in particular. What can we do to build empathy for people who don't see us connected in the global way that you do and the work of the Carter Center does?
Well, I think there's so much on social media that you can see these stories about what's happening. And you just have to, whatever religion you come from, usually have a moral compass that tells you, you should help other people. You should help those less fortunate. And so sometimes it's hard to teach empathy. And, we've said this, we've raised 3 kids, and we often say, you can teach sympathy, but you can't really teach empathy in many cases. And so it's making sure that people understand where they're coming from, their own privilege, their own ability to have food on the table, and then the people who don't have food on the table, the people who can't make their mortgage payments. And I think that's a generational learning that has been lost a little bit. I certainly know my parents taught me that, but I don't often see parents actually having some of those tough conversations. And it goes with having the conversations with your neighbors about it too. What if you were a little boy and you had no dinner tonight? Like, what if your son was unable to go to school because he had to work in the fields? And so sometimes you just have to help situate people in those places. And
And start young too. Like that's the a very important point. So thank you for that. So lots of changes happening in the U.S. and in our policy. Is there other ways in which the work of the Carter Center is being impacted by the policies and of the new administration?
Well, we're really fortunate, and I see 2 of our donors over there with Priscilla and John. We have an amazing donor base at the Carter Center. President Carter and Mrs. Carter were around for 40 years, and they were actively engaged in the center. And people remembered his presidency, or they remembered good things about Habitat for Humanity, which is not related to us, but it is from the same moral values place that President and Mrs. Carter came from. And so we have a lot of donors, which is helpful. So when the U.S. government shut off assistance, it affected us about 10% of our programs. And we weren't able to work in areas in Sudan and in Hispaniola, which is the DR and Haiti combined, that island. We weren't able to do the programs, and we were so close to elimination of river blindness in the Western Hemisphere, except for this one little area in the Yanomami tribe. And so we have worked really hard to make up the difference, and we can do it because people support the Carter Center. So I think as I've looked across at a lot of organizations, there was a study done on 1,000 federally funded nonprofit organizations. 50% of them, no, 1 in 3 have had to cut 80% of staff or more. And out of the 1,000 organizations in the Global South, 50% of those are going to go under in the next 2 months if they haven't already. So yes, there was a lot of assumption that the U.S. federal government was going to help fund these organizations because they were doing good work, and they were doing good work. But now they need other people in the community to step in and help with that. And the Carter Center is very fortunate because we have a great donor base that it hasn't affected us as greatly as it's affected other organizations.
So many of our speakers this season have talked about the policy impact of USAID going away or the Doge Cuts. I don't know that I've heard a lot about the people who had given their entire careers, right, working in these organizations to do this good work on behalf of America. And the American people. So you worked at USAID. I'm sure you still have friends who have been impacted directly, or friends who worked in the federal government who may have been impacted by the Doge Cuts. And could you say a little bit around how are the people doing, and what does it mean for their future, knowing that maybe I've spent my entire career, but that entire career has kind of disappeared, and who knows if and when it might come back?
Yeah, so I'll say it's heartbreaking to me on a number of levels. One, because USAID was my home for 2 decades, and there are 14,000 employees who just went wherever the U.S. taxpayer dollars said they needed to go. And at AID, it was not like we're sending you to Paris or London. It was we're sending you to Ouagadougou and South Sudan, and these were places that people went and they brought their families. And so, to be honest, the cruelty of these cuts that happened, in the dark of night, usually on a Friday, usually the last week of the month, so that cut off their medical plans. I mean, I had a friend who was pregnant, and she was due the following month, and she no longer had any medical coverage. So these happen in the cruelest of ways. I can certainly understand the need for reform. I worked in the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration. There were reforms. We did them. Some were better than others. But the way that this is being done is harmful to the American public, and it's harmful to, just in the case of AID, 14,000 staff. But at State Department, we're seeing the same things. And again, I take this personally because our oldest daughter was in the job of her dreams at State Department in the Global Women's Issues Office. And she saw the writing on the wall. They have now they've ended the office. Everyone has gotten RIF notices. She was smarter than I think we gave her credit for by deciding that she was going to go to law school. So she applied in January and she took an early buyout. But this was truly the job of her dreams. So no one's looking at gender-based violence or atrocity prevention now. And the U.S. and our American exceptionalism, we would write those reports. So who's writing those reports now? Where are they coming from? Who is holding these despots and these authoritarians accountable for the crimes that are being committed? And so I worry a lot that aid has been pulled down, that State Department is being pulled down. I will tell you, these people have now been let loose in the United States, and I really hope that they're going to use their power to make sure our communities are well-fed, educated, the policies and the laws that all of us care deeply about are somehow going to be carried out now by these folks either running for office or supporting good candidates who do that.
We're doing really well on time, so I'm going to go, a little bit off script here almost. So a lot of these feel like seismic shifts to me. What do you think are going to be the forces that shape nonprofit work in the next 3, 5, 10 years or so?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think, and as Chautauqua looks at this too, because you have to look at your competition of other arts and culture institutions and where people want to put their money. I think the shift we're going to see is a realization, as has happened throughout the last few months, that, maybe we actually do need someone looking at hurricane awareness or, a famine early warning system, or maybe all of the sorghum that is shipped from Kansas that went through Food for Peace that the U.S. government bought. Now you got a bunch of Kansas farmers who 49% of their crops were sorghum. People in the United States don't buy sorghum unless you're gluten-free, in which case, yay, sorghum. But on a whole, it's not a crop that the U.S. needs, but it is a crop that feeds people overseas. And now you have a bunch of Kansas farmers who have no place to sell it. So I think you're going to start seeing nonprofit organizations pop up that try to figure out, that consolidate the fields. I mean, I'll tell you, the Carter Center has spent 40 years looking at elections overseas and monitoring elections. And over that 40 years, 5 other election monitoring organizations in the U.S. has popped up. So when we look overseas to do an election in Bangladesh or Guyana, where we're going at the beginning of September, normally we'd be kind of fighting with 5 other organizations who want to monitor the Guyanese elections. Well, maybe we didn't need 5 organizations, maybe 1 or 2 are fine. So we're finding ways to bring some of that expertise in-house, and I think you're starting to see that. You're seeing the consolidation of the nonprofit sector, and so hopefully stronger and better, more intentional programming. And you all, as you think about groups you want to follow and look at online and see what kind of work they're doing, there probably will be a lot of Johnny-come-latelys to the field, but they're going to be made up of really important people, and not to undercut our ability to fundraise. We've been around for 40 years and we're not going anywhere. But I think that you're going to find new organizations that are popping up in your community and that your kids know or your friends know. And you should look into them because a lot of good people are going to be starting this type of work.
I love that answer. The only piece that didn't make sense to me was paying attention to our competition, because we don't have any, because there's no other place like Shitakqua, right? I had to crack that joke. So let's stick with this theme of paying attention to the young people. That I know, as a former college dean, I still mentor a lot of students who are still in my life, and many of them want to do good, right? They want to do good work, and the whole field of nonprofit work, the do good work, is up in the air, and some of my young people are feeling very disillusioned. What would be your message to them? What would be your message to them? What would be your advice to them to stick to their goals and values?
Yeah, I think, we spend 40 hours at work. That's we spend more time awake at work than we do at home with our families. And so people should always do what they really care about and what they're passionate about, whether it's law or medicine or international development. It's important for kids these days to find a passion. And I think that if they are passionate about the future of America, the future of the world, they need to stay and fight the fight. I mean, I will tell you, we told our daughter, because I had gone between Clinton and Bush, I had said, oh, no, you need to stay in the administration, be there to fight the good fight. And then into January, I'm like, get out now. I don't think this is going to work. So what I tell young people, and we've got 3 kids who fit into this category of professionals and young professionals, is follow your passion. It is an important time to double down on what you care about. I like to say it's a lot like if you get a heart bypass or if you break your arm or break your leg and suddenly your other muscles atrophy, and you can't let these other muscles atrophy. It's important that when the heart comes back online and when your cast comes off, that the rest of your body is fully functioning. And so that's what I count on the next generation, hopefully the next generation, to do, is to make sure that they're going strategically into places with surgical, tactical decisions about what they're going to do. It might not be the global, I'm going to be in government, I'm going to work at USAID, but it might be the, I'm going to go build a house in Haiti, or I'm going to go and teach a class overseas. And so I would say stick with it, as our daughter is doing. She'll go to law school, and then she'll be professionally capable of winning every argument against us for the rest of our lives, but it's a good place for her to spend the next 3 years. And so from my perspective, what I tell students and what I tell our kids is stay the course. There's still work to be done. It's a tough market, but there's development adjacent work that can be done.
Thank you. Let me get started by asking, what keeps you up at night?
Oh, I can't say little kids anymore. The Carter Center, we have 300 employees in Atlanta and 3,400 people overseas. And so at absolutely any time, a rock is being thrown into the car and my staff person who's in Ramallah, or the Sudan government has come in and blown up our offices where we've been doing global health work. So it is kind of a constant fear I have for the safety and security of our staff. It doesn't always keep me up, but then the phone rings and it keeps me up. So I wake up to that a lot.
Okay. So in every crisis, one of our audience members asked, in every crisis there's an opportunity. Can you share any insights on any opportunities you might see in the current moment?
So, interesting question. I think there's a lot of opportunities. One, I mentioned the contraction of the nonprofit community. I think that that's an opportunity for us to be smarter and do this work better and more strategically. I also see opportunities, the example I gave for the drugs that we're distributing in Mozambique and Ethiopia. The reason we're able to do that is because we work with a UK group called Sight Savers, and we have that trust with them, and so we are giving them a grant to do the distribution. And now they have trust with us, so when the Foreign Commercial Office, which is the UK government, wanted them to do some work in Ethiopia, they turned and gave that piece of work to us. So you're seeing sort of synergies in the community that we wouldn't necessarily have had when we were competing with each other as much. I also see folks realizing what's happening. I mean, there is this wonderful opportunity now that people are starting to see this is not normal. Like, this might not be what we want to be. And so you're seeing more people come into the conversation. I mean, how many of you knew who and what USAID was before February? Okay, well, it's Chautauqua. So I should have actually, that was a softball, I guess. But I will tell you, when I go places now and someone introduces me as having been at USAID, I usually get like everyone feels sorry. Well, USAID wasn't really known before all of this happened. And so I think there are people who are now realizing, and the domestic audience. Again, as I mentioned, the Kansas farmers, that's a perfect example that when I called the head of the Kansas Farmers Association and said, so what's your plan with all the sorghum? And he said, oh, no, it goes to Food for Peace. And I said, that's USAID. That's just one of the offices in USAID. He said, oh, no, we have a contract. I was like, and I'm pretty sure you're going to get a termination notice on that contract. So it starts a snowball effect where the opportunity is people now see what is being done with your tax dollars. 36 cents of your tax dollars goes to USAID. That's it. Out of all the taxes anyone pays, 36 cents is what goes to USAID. So in that case, I think that's the message I would like in this crisis to be getting out versus that we're all criminals.
Folks are curious about volunteering at the Carter Center. What opportunities might folks have to do that?
Thank you. So I would encourage everyone to go online at cartercenter.org. We don't have that many volunteer opportunities, so we used to do a lot for election monitoring and evaluation. We bring people in, and if you are in Arizona or Michigan or Georgia, there's some places that we're going to be doing, Montana, that we're going to be doing more election observations. So if you're in those places, we would love to have you be part of the work that we're doing domestically. Internationally, unless you want to work on schistosomiasis, which how you check that is going through fecal matter, it's not really fun. So we don't get a lot of volunteers for doing some of those programs. So, but looking and being able to support and know that your dollars are going to what Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter always wanted to do is important. So that's one way to volunteer, but it is your financial support for it. Not that I'm here to make that pitch, but if you are in Montana or Arizona or Michigan or Georgia, and there'll be a few other states, we will have opportunities domestically.
Thanks. Actually, that leads right into to a question I just received, and it says, could you discuss the Carter Center's partial pivot to partially doing more U.S.-based work as opposed to being more focused on international work?
Yeah, well, I don't want to do too much of a spoiler alert for my conversation tomorrow, but it was a discussion that I had when I came in June 2020, and I went down to Plains and talked to President and Mrs. Carter about it, and I just said, I don't know how we can be legitimate or be validated overseas if we're telling Venezuela, you're not doing your elections properly, and we've got 5-hour lines in Fulton County. And so it was a conversation we had. I explained that I didn't have time between June 2020 and the November election that year to go out and ask for money from the Koch brothers and the Soros Foundation to prove that we are nonpartisan. And we are 100% nonpartisan. We don't care about the outcome of the election. We care about the integrity of the election itself. And so President Carter, being ever so frugal, said, do not spend all my money. Said, I know people like you, do not spend my money. And he said, but I'll let you take some of our endowment earnings and actually do that work domestically. And so that was part of the pivot. But at the end of the day, I talked about our 3,700 employees. They didn't come to the Carter Center to work on political violence in Arizona. They came to the Carter Center to work on this in Sudan and Mali. And so we've had a pivot, but it is not so much of a pivot that it is turning us on our side. But I think it's important to do, because if we're not willing to hold a mirror up to ourselves, we won't be credible overseas.
Thank you. So we have a question that says, perhaps it is underappreciated how many USAID and State Department employees are Chautauquans, including myself, the person who wrote that. Why do you think that the international development community has failed to develop a strong domestic constituency for our work?
Great question, and one that, since Pew has been doing the polling for 40 years on how much money do you think is spent of your tax dollars on, or how much of the how much of the budget is spent on foreign aid? And Pew has done this polling, and people say 20%. And then how much should be spent? 10%. And then when you tell them that less than 0.5% is the federal budget, people are shocked. But for reasons I don't understand, and whoever's from AID here who asked that question, we've never gotten that message out. And so we have all of the information to show that your tax dollars, your 36 cents, is going to a good cause. And for reasons I don't understand, we can't get that message out. A lot of it is because it's going places and it's going to people who don't look like us. And we don't really, could you find Chad or South Sudan on a map? I was really struggling to do that when I started working in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I'm maybe more worried about the Head Start program in my neighborhood than I am about the kids dying in foreign countries. And so it's a push and pull. And when people are worried about their own neighborhood, their own ability to put food on the table, they really don't care about someone 10,000 miles away who's dying of malnutrition. It's just human nature. But we should be able to do better. And I'm not a communications person. I'm not a PR person. If anyone is on Instagram, please look at the Friends of USAID Instagram page. It tells this stuff in plain, simple English that then allows you to bring it back and talk to your neighbors about it. But we didn't start that. We didn't get that going because we were part of the federal government. We didn't have to justify our existence up until now.
So we have three people wondering about, is the Carter Center involved in Gaza, and if so, how?
Yes. So, wow, that took a whole 45 minutes for that to come up. I will say one of the conversations I had with Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter when I first took the job, I walk in and President Carter says to me, "So I understand you're Jewish." And I thought, wow, you're going to start with that question of your new CEO? And I actually even said that out loud to him. I was so shocked he had asked me that. And he said, "I want to know what a Jewish CEO of the Carter Center is going to do when Hamas does something stupid and Israel has a disproportionate response." That was January 2020. He said that to me. And he said, out of everything I did, the one thing I failed at, because he thought he only failed at one thing, which was quite cute, and I have other people in my life who feel that way about things. He said the one thing I failed at was at Camp David was not solving the Palestine question. And he said, "I've told every single president since Reagan, you have to take care of the Palestine question. And if you don't, it will haunt your administration forever." And we've managed to go through a bunch of presidents, and it has not haunted them. And Bill Clinton tried, and the Oslo Accords were good. But he said this to Biden, too. And every president has said, that's a second-term issue. It's really hard to take thorny issues like that and address them. So then the question comes, what can the Carter Center do? You know, if Jimmy Carter were speaking out, Lord only knows what he would say. And I'm sure we would have a lot of difficult discussions about how he would want to be out there on this. It is hard to move the needle as a nonprofit organization. And so quietly, we do work. I was in Gaza, about 6 months before the war started. We have an office in Ramallah. We do work on intra-Palestinian dialogue. The Palestinians have to find a way to come to the table in a way with a government that is going to be able to have these conversations. And the Israelis have to listen. And it is not about the citizens of Israel, who I think on a whole, as we've heard this week, and Jeremy Ben-Ami and others have talked, they don't necessarily support their government. And a number of us here in the U.S. don't support this current government. But at the end of the day, these are our neighbors. And what President Carter did in Camp David Accords is got us peace on the border with Egypt. And that was the most important thing that has happened in the last 50 years. So how do we get the right people at the table to have the conversation about peace in the Middle East? And so that is what the Carter Center works on. We work with other donors, not the U.S. government. We work with, I know Roger Carstens is coming in, and so you'll probably hear him talk about sort of hostage negotiations. We play a very quiet role. President Carter was responsible for the exchange of letters and the proof of life between Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier that had been captured, between his parents and Hamas. So we talk to everyone. I'll say I don't personally talk to Hamas. I don't think they necessarily want to see me, but I have great people on staff who have those conversations. And that's important. If we don't have dialogue, we're never going to get anywhere. So that's what the Carter Center does, is try to enable that dialogue.
So some of it is almost like there's direct visible work, and then there's the soft power invisible work that happens. So this next question kind of relates to that. The Carter Center's international work is great and positive example of American soft power overseas. With the demolition of USAID, could you please speak to its impact to the U.S. government and NGOs' soft power to the world?
Yeah, well, so there is one slight benefit, because when we go overseas and we have conversations that are not because we're there because the U.S. government has paid for it. We actually can go a little further. When we are there as a neutral convener that we are not being paid for to do a very specific program, it gives us a neutrality that we don't always have with federal funds. And so I think the soft power that nonprofit organizations have is that they're there for the long haul. You know, we've been in the Middle East for 40 years. We have been in Liberia. Here's an example. We were in Liberia, and when the Ebola outbreak hit, and the Centers for Disease Control would send their scientists over and tell religious leaders, you cannot bury your dead this way. You are killing people by trying to wash the body and do all the religious ceremonies that they would do. And none of the religious leaders would listen to the scientists because they had just flown in that day and they didn't know anything about Liberia and they didn't know anything about the religious culture. But we had been there for 20 years. And so we sat down with the religious leaders and said, okay, what is the most important part of your tradition? Like, can the one person bathe the body wearing PPE for the whole time? Or can you switch out with 4 people? Like, does the whole community have to come and say goodbye to somebody? Like, how do we do this that meets your needs? And because of that, we were able to solve that problem, and we were able to stop the spread of Ebola in some of the villages. But that's the soft power that a long-standing NGO who's been on the ground has. And so sometimes the CDC can't fly in and do this, and sometimes a foreign government can't fly in and say this is how you should do it. And so I think there's still a lot of soft power to be had by organizations that are there, that are proximate, and that actually listen to folks.
Thank you. We have an audience member who also works at a global NGO. The government cuts brought a loss of funding, but also have reduced the willingness for folks to take risks. So they ask, you mentioned Haiti. Our work in Congo has been heavily impacted. How do we make the case for new funders to take risks with us at the end of the road?
So that's a great question, and obviously one I struggle with. It does not keep me up because, as I said, my boss was quite frugal, so we are fortunate that way. But it is hard, especially in DRC, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is in many ways a forgotten, corrupt regime that has oil and has diamonds and has lots of mineral wealth. And corporate social responsibility needs to step into the void here now. And so for me, that's the conversation that we want to have with corporates. I would say the business leaders and the business communities all signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of those. And SDG 17 is this public-private partnership. And so Bill Gates can't make up the difference in everything the World Health Organization was funding. He's got a lot of money, and he's going to burn it down for the next 20 years. And then he said, I'll be 90, and I want to get out of this business. So he's doubling down, and we're seeing him spend a lot more money, but it's never going to make up the difference. I think there was a report that said private funders and other foreign funders can only make up 28% of the lost funds from USAID. And so with that, how do you convince others to come to the table? You prove that you have proof of theory that your programs are working, that they are changing mindsets, that they're addressing the needs, and that you're just not coming in having done a request for proposals, answered something that the U.S. government said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we did this? That's not what you're doing. You're working from the ground up, and then you're bringing them with you to pitch the donors, to have those conversations. And as soon as the linkages are made that, as I said, flies know no borders. So as soon as river blindness shows up in southern Florida, I am pretty sure that we're going to see a lot more people willing to address some of these issues. And you don't want to wait until that happens. You want to show that if you're doing modeling, predictive modeling of what could happen, you can take that to a business owner or a business executive and say, if you don't address this issue, this is going to affect your bottom line.
Thank you. This is Shitakqua asks, can you address the intentionality with which you divide your work at the Carter Center between direct service deliverables and systemic change initiatives? And has that ratio shifted in the last 8 months?
Wow, I did forget how smart this group is. That's a really, it's a difficult question to answer because our direct services is often working with the nonprofit organizations on the ground who are doing the direct service. We consider that system strengthening. If I am working with a group in the Democratic Republic of Congo that's calling out the corrupt practices of the mining community, and then we can get policy at the government level to write this up, and it becomes policy that corporates have to work a certain way. That's the whole thing. That is direct service to help the NGO that wanted to do it. There's an organization called, in Congo, it's going to come to me. There's a bug somewhere. A chipmunk, oh. Yeah, they're not so cute up close, are they? Save Congo, I think it's called Save Congo. But this is when you see systemic change, when you're able to work specifically with NGOs that want to do something, and then the international organization can come in and up the game, because I can't go into a country that doesn't want to meet with the CEO of the Carter Center because everyone's got a story about their time with Jimmy Carter. And every president wants to talk about how his mother, worked with Jimmy Carter or was a community drug distributor. And so I get these amazing meetings that then give me a platform to be able to say, hey, I met with the NGO leaders today, and they're concerned about X, Y, and Z. What do you plan to do about it? So it's sort of a yin and yang of local and international coming in to help elevate that.
Well, unfortunately, we're getting close to the end of time, and I have so many good questions, but I'm going to ask this last question. Given your experience with authoritarian countries and other countries that are experiencing a backslide in democracy, what advice do you have for us about effective opposition now that we are the opposition?
Well, I think the opposition exists on both sides, and I don't want to do too much of a spoiler alert because I do talk about the need, as Selena talked about, to resist, to actually, it's not all about protest, it's about re-engaging and renewing your role in the world as an American citizen. And so everyone is capable of doing something different. I was talking to my mom, some of my mom's friends are here, about the fact that she's sitting at home watching TV and just getting herself totally worked up. And as we say to our kids, you have to unplug. And I say to my 91-year-old mom, you need to unplug. You've got to disconnect. You still have the ability to pick up the phone and call a member of Congress. You have the ability to write a check. You have the ability to show up and show that you're interested. All of those things, you can't retreat. Now is not the time to retreat. It is so painful sometimes to listen to what's happening, but you should also be empowered by that. We are still living in a democracy, and we still have one person, one vote, one voice. And so for me, you've got to find the optimism. You've got to see that, yes, the glass is broken and it's half full, but there's a way to fill it back up. But it's our responsibility to do that. And that means teaching our kids, talking to our neighbors, having those conversations, and finding groups that you agree with that you can actually get behind.
Thank you. Well, Chautauqua friends, I hope you enjoyed this fireside chat, which is just the precursor, or sort of the appetizer to the main course, which will be the 10:45 lecture tomorrow. So I hope you come back. If I didn't get to your question, ask it tomorrow. Thank you so much for being here, and join me one more time in thanking Paige Alexander for being here. Thank you.